Welcome once again to Heart of a Shepherd as we continue our study of the prophecies of Isaiah. And we're today in Isaiah chapter 47 and 48. The title of the devotional, Babylon Will Fail, but Israel Will Not Be Forgotten. I do invite you to open your Bible and follow with us as we continue our prophetic study in this particular devotional of the fall of Babylon. Now, Isaiah's prophecies concerning God's judgment of Babylon and its destruction is really the subject of our study today. And as you look at Isaiah 46 and verse 1 through 2, just recalling that the false gods of Babylon had failed the people. And the God of Israel comforted his people in captivity with the assurance, quote, I bring near my righteousness, it shall not be far off, and my salvation shall not tarry. And I will place salvation in Zion, for Israel my glory. And so that was predicted even before the captivity began. The captivity in Babylon would last 70 years, but the comfort to God's people throughout those 70 years was that God will not forget you. Now, let's look at this prophecy regarding the humiliation of Babylon. Isaiah 47 and verse 1 through 5. Now, as we come to Isaiah 47, we do find Babylon's fall and humiliation foretold by Isaiah with the words, quote, Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground, there is no throne. And with those words, the prophecy that Babylon would be destroyed is on the record. Now, if you'll notice with me, we're given some insight into the culture of Babylon in Isaiah 47 and verse 1, where we see a description of the wealth and the leisure of Babylonian women described as tender and delicate. And yet, Isaiah prophesied that those women who had perhaps enjoyed having slaves to do their bidding, those same women of Babylon would be reduced to poverty and the task of lowly household slaves grinding grain. Now, the fall of Babylon, you see, would force the citizens of that great city to flee across streams, Isaiah 47 and verse 2. And those women would suffer humiliation as we read, quote, their nakedness would be uncovered and seen by all nations. So the picture there is of this great city of Babylon that really was the trophy of all nations, that city would be reduced to absolute poverty by the conquering Persians. Babylon would, quote, no more be called the Lady of Kingdoms, verse 5. And then we have a description of the destruction of Babylon in verses 6 through 8. Now, Babylon would serve as God's vessel to punish his people for their sins, for the Lord had declared, I was wroth, that is, I was angry with my people, speaking of Israel, I have polluted mine inheritance and given them into thine, Babylon's, hand. And so Babylon, the army of Nebuchadnezzar, had been allowed to conquer Jerusalem and lead away the people into captivity, but it was God's doing, not man's, that delivered his people to Babylon. But it was only for a season. Babylon would conquer Israel and serve the Lord's purpose to judge his people for their sins. However, that nation, Babylon's abuses, stirred God's wrath against that city. The Chaldeans, you see, were cruel, they were proud, careless, we read, failing to weigh the consequences of their wickedness, and self-centered, verses 7 and 8. And then notice verses 9 through 10, where we have the judgment of Babylon. Now, Isaiah prophesied that the sins of Babylon would result in God's judgment, and the families of that great city would be lost. The false prophets had failed the nation, and the people of Babylon were deluded and boasted they could commit all manner of evil. Verse 10, for none seeth me. They boasted they were his God. And they said, I am, and none else beside me. And so really it was a great offense against the God of heaven. Perhaps they even had some knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures, and they were using that in mocking in the presence of the Jewish people. Well, we come to verses 11 through 15, where we have recorded what I am describing as the delusion of Babylon. Now, Babylon provoked the Lord, and he admonished that city, therefore shall evil come upon thee, upon you, Babylon. Thou shalt not know from whence it riseth, and mischief shall fall upon thee, and thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know. Now listen, we know from the record in the book of Daniel that what is described in verse 11 happened exactly like that. Babylon was conquered in a night without the city even knowing that the enemies were entering into the city that very night. And so verse 11 was to come true. Now all in whom Babylon placed her trust would fail. Verse 12 through 13. Her gods would fail her. The false prophets failed. The wise men failed. The astrologers failed. They all failed and left the nation helpless and hopeless. And so Isaiah warned in verse 15, none shall save thee. And then notice Isaiah 48. And here we have the Lord's promise. He will deliver Israel. Now, verses 1 through 11, we're again reminded that the Lord had not forsaken Israel. And so we have seen the prophecies of Babylon's destruction in chapter 47. And so we ask the question, what would become of the Jews of the captivity? Well, the record of that is in verses 1 through 11 of chapter 48. Now, Israel and Judah had vowed, quote, by the name of the Lord. Isaiah, however, declared their hypocrisy, for they had made mention of the God of Israel, but not in truth nor in righteousness. It is like in our culture today where someone professes, well, I'm a Christian, and yet there's nothing about their life that shows any of the fruits of the Spirit. They show none of the likeness of Christ. They are more like the world than they would ever be like Christ. And so it is in our culture. So it was then. There were some that would boast of the name of the Lord, and yet their lives were far from Him. Well, we read in verse 2 that they identified with, quote, the holy city. And still the Lord declared they were obstinate and stubborn with necks like sinew. Verse 3. And to prove He was God, the Lord revealed the future in such detail that no idolaters could declare, quote, mine idol hath done them, my molten image hath commanded them. Though through the prophets the Lord foretold what would come to pass, and left His people with no doubt that He alone was God. Then notice with me verses 12 through 22, what I would suggest is the sovereignty and providence of God. And so we ask the question, who is the God of Israel? I had someone recently on a YouTube responded to me, which God? Well, I wrote back something along these lines that you find in verse 12. He is the eternal God, the first and the last, or as John would write in Revelation, He's the Alpha and Omega. We also see the revelation that He is the Creator, and we read, quote, who laid the foundation of the earth, and by His right hand hath spanned the heavens. 48 and verse 13. A century before Cyrus was born, Isaiah prophesied the Lord would raise up a man whom He, quote, hath loved, who would do His pleasure on Babylon, and His arm shall be on the Chaldeans. Now, this is a century before Cyrus would even be born. And yet, that prophecy was fulfilled exactly by Cyrus, king of Persia. Well, a closing thought for today. And the question is, what became of Israel, of Judah, of God's covenant people? Well, while other ancient nations were destroyed and their people were assimilated into the population of the victors, Israel would not be forgotten by God. The Lord had prepared a man, Cyrus, who would have his way with Babylon, and he would, quote, make Cyrus's way prosper, verse 15. Now, though his people, Israel, would be led into captivity, the Lord declared he was their, quote, Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, the Lord thy God, which leadeth thee by the way, verse 17. When Babylon would be defeated, the Lord promised it would be said, verse 20, the Lord hath redeemed his servant Jacob, Jacob being Israel. Notice the word redeemed. In other words, Israel, the Jews, would return back to their land, not as the slaves of Persia, but as redeemed free men. Well, the children of Israel would be freed to return to their homeland. As the Lord cared for their fathers in the wilderness, he promised he would provide for them. Well, our study concludes with an ominous warning, and we read in verse 22, there is no peace, saith the Lord, unto the wicked. In the words of King Solomon, Proverbs 13 and verse 15, the way of transgressors is hard. Now, don't misunderstand. I understand that you might have family and friends that enjoy the pleasures of sin. But I would remind you, it's the pleasure of sin, but for a season. And you can be assured, beneath the veneer of the narcissistic, self-centered sinner, there is an emptiness, a vanity, a hollowness, a sorrow that only God can fulfill. May you and I not look at the pleasures of the world and desire them. May we look to the Lord, who has promised, I'm with you. Well, God bless you. Thank you for being a part of the Heart of a Shepherd. Bye-bye.